As I promised, the conversation with Zane Dangor begins now. He's the Director General of the Department of International Relations and Cooperation. He served as the G20 Sherpa. So this is the man that was leading negotiations and making sure that G20 countries are aligned on the issues that would be adopted through a leaders' declaration at the summit. Before we started the show this morning, I recorded a conversation with him. Here's how it went. Mr. Dangor, thank you so much for making time for us, and congratulations on organizing and running a successful G20 summit.
No, thanks, and it's good to be with you, Clement.
Yeah. What did it take? I mean, because I kept explaining over the weekend as we were broadcasting live from Nasrec that this is not work that sort of just started this weekend. So yes, we talk about the G20 summit, but it's a culmination of negotiations and a lot of work that's happened over the last 12 months.
So it's more than 12 months, right? So when we knew from the midway into Brazil's presidency, we started doing our preparation already. So defining the themes was one thing. Looking at where would the ideal venue be for an event in South Africa. What are the actors that need to be involved from a content development perspective to logistics? What is the architecture that we needed to put in place to ensure that we can have a whole of government approach? So that work started quite some time ago. Then, of course, with the start of our presidency, the very first Sherpa meeting, for example, was December 2024. And that Sherpa meeting, which was a joint meeting with the finance track, laid the basis for us to articulate what our priorities are, what our themes are, and to get the buy-in of the other members of the G20 and also those international organizations and guest countries participating. That then led into, putting a calendar of events for an entire year into place. And the calendar events would be the ministerial meetings. But then before every ministerial meeting, you're going to have a number of working group meetings that prepares the basis for the ministerial discussions to take place.
Yeah.
So this calendar of events spanned 10 months, generally. So it was an intense 10 months. Within that, we had foreign ministers meeting, 2 of those. We had 4 Sherpa meetings, the last one being the most important always in the G20 calendar, where everything that has happened, every working group, every finance track decision is subjected to checking and renegotiations, and of course also the geopolitics having to be negotiated, and then packaging all of this with line-by-line negotiations and agreement in the last 5 days. But also, of course, there's virtual negotiations also took place. So it's been quite an intense period. So as you pointed out, it's not a 2-day. What you see in the 2 days is really the outcome of more than 12 months.
Yeah.
Work.
So given the current geopolitical dynamics, did that make it difficult behind the scenes during the negotiations with other Sherpas?
The negotiations in the G20 can be difficult under the best of circumstances, particularly on geopolitical matters. But this year has been described as perhaps more difficult than others. Comparisons were made with President Trump's first term when Japan was the G20 president in 2019, where you had a formulation that was arrived at 19 plus 1, because the U.S. wouldn't be part of any consensus, and then particularly on climate action. What we've encountered this time around is, not joining a consensus, but refusing to participate and using misinformation as the basis for that non-participation. And then in the last couple of months, weeks really, suggesting that after agreeing to participate and participating in the ministerial and then suddenly deciding not to participate, the procedures and rules of the G20 had to be negotiated and discussed at the Sherpa level, because this was unprecedented. The voluntary absenteeism of a member. We had to then discuss what does this mean for consensus, and eventually we all agreed that consensus is about those who participate, and there's no prohibition of anybody participating, right? So it changes. You can obviously not say you can arrive at consensus if 2 or 3 delegations, for example, are not given visas to participate, or are prohibited from coming to meetings. This was not the case. This was a case of voluntary absenteeism, and then a demand linked to that you cannot have an outcome if we are not there voluntarily. It laid the basis for discussion on how you arrive at consensus in the G20, but also what it means for multilateralism generally, where unilateral action should not be allowed to undermine the will of the collective. And that's what we arrived at.
And speaking of consensus, one of the successes of the summit is that you were able to secure consensus on the joint declaration on the first day of the summit. Just take us through what was happening behind the scenes, because that was quite a key diplomatic move there. It was quite strategic, but how were you able to do that?
Look, the negotiations was intense, and it's not the first time this was done. I can't give you the instance, but I think in India there was also a early announcement of the declaration, so that the discussions could then continue, right? But there was a significant feeling by the leaders, and of course informed by their Sherpas, that we need to conclude the declaration as soon as possible, so that we get into the details of the thematics, so that leaders can speak on the thematics. We don't want leaders to engage in negotiations that those who are reporting to them and have laid the basis are already done, right? So, because of the behind-the-scenes note-verbals, we were also quite aware that pressure would be put on. The longer the document stays open and not approved, there could be pressures. But many leaders approached our own leader and suggested, let's gavel the declaration at the beginning, so that we have the basis to speak freely on the themes going forward in a meeting that needed to address critical issues on critical minerals, artificial intelligence, debt sustainability, and that worked out, and that's why it was such a successful meeting. Is that it was all about substance, because the substance had been negotiated, and the document had been negotiated and agreed right up front. And it's, as you pointed out, it's only fair that you do that, because essentially leaders don't negotiate.
Yeah.
That's up to us to do so.
Yeah. What reservations did Argentina have, and how did you resolve those? Because after it was announced that consensus was secured, and then Argentina came out and said, we need to be honest when sufficient consensus has not been secured. How did you resolve that?
So Argentina was very flexible in the negotiations and in the Sherpa meeting. Argentina's red lines were gender equality, sustainable development goals. Okay. Yeah. And then they were basically questioning whether you could have a consensus without the US, even if they were consenting, right? But they were negotiating towards that kind of consensus. And we had agreed on the formulation in the very first paragraph of the declaration, which indicated that this does not include the U.S. It says those leaders gathered here. And we had a huge discussion about whether we footnote specifically the U.S. And the feeling was, no, then we're particularizing the U.S. And it's better just to talk about those gathered here. So Argentina was part of that consensus. And it was only on the last day after they left the room around past midnight of the day, in a few hours before we were to gavel, that they were not there then to bring in any other red line that we didn't know about. And then so the issue about talking about occupied Palestinian territories was raised as a concern. They didn't want that.
But that ended up in the declaration.
It did, because you see, but that was after the negotiations.
Oh, okay.
And that's accepted legal. You know, we didn't say Palestine. The initial language was Palestine.
Yeah.
Because we said Sudan, DRC, Palestine, and Ukraine. Now, you must understand the balance of these things is that you're not going to get the Europeans agreeing to a declaration without mentioning Ukraine. For South Africa, Sudan, DRC was important. And for everybody, mentioning Palestine was important because we're looking at the gravest wars and conflicts, right? We use gravity as a defining who do we mention, and because you could have had an option of not mentioning any countries, but that would not have suited many delegations. So we then changed it through negotiations into using the occupied Palestinian territories and not Palestine, which was the key concern from Argentina. So when they raised that in plenary, it was their concern that, you know, we had negotiations. We all agreed on this, but they're still unhappy about it. It's not about disassociating themselves. They're just noting that, but that doesn't change the declaration that's been accepted. It's so fascinating, Director General, because, you know, one of the things I've enjoyed doing is just study the language during these kind of discussions, because it's almost like every word matters, like the word you use, the comma, the full stop, because you need consensus. So one of the things I was really impressed by is how the summit has firmly placed the interests of the continent at the heart of conversations. I mean, there are many African issues that have found expression in the declarations that were adopted. Do you look at the declarations as South Africa and say, okay, we have achieved what we actually wanted to achieve out of this G20 summit? Yes, I mean, every single one of South Africa's priorities is agreed. Some of them stand alone. So, for example, you know, in inclusive development, it was agreed. Our critical minerals framework was agreed. You know, disaster resilience was agreed to. Artificial intelligence, you know, for the common good, I'm just using the colloquial language, was agreed. You know, debt sustainability was agreed to. So all of the priorities that we felt was important for us, but was also important for the African continent, was agreed to. You know, and we had certain issues that we felt that were cross-cutting that had to be in a declaration negotiated in South Africa. So, you know, gender equality and the empowerment of women, for example, which was another red line for the US and Argentina. But I must say, Argentina was so flexible when it came to a situation where on gender equality, I asked the Argentinian Sherpa to facilitate a small group to get to consensus amongst those who. And he did that, and they delivered that. I mean, it took us 8 hours to just negotiate one paragraph. But really, all of the key issues for the African continent and our perspective was delivered in this. The challenge is always about how do you then translate this into policies and strategies that are implementable at national levels. But it's about how we hold ourselves accountable to implement what we agree.
Yeah. And speaking of implementation, what's next? Because, I mean, unity is when multilateralism is won, but where to from now? Because I would imagine the real work really starts now. And are you at all worried about some of the resolutions of the summit possibly going to be dropped next year when the U.S. takes over the presidency?
Clement, I think to a certain extent we future-proofed our priorities. So the report on inequality is a standalone report. We asked our members to endorse and support, but we're not going to negotiate it because we felt that the inequality report needed to go beyond the G20. It needed to be championed by UNECA, the AU, the UN. And one of the recommendations, for example, on the establishment of a technical committee to monitor inequality and report on that was supported, and already the UN is looking at how do they take this up as part of their mandate, right? So then also the panel discussions, the panel report chaired by former Minister Manuel included the debt sustainability issue. That already is going to be taken up by UNECA and others to look at how do we use the momentum that the G20 had agreed to this to shape how debt sustainability is championed within the IMF and the World Bank. Again, it's standalone because we also felt, the continuity is important, but and continuity then leads to implementation. Because what we agree this year gets refined in 1 or 2 years and then gets implemented. We are aware that the US is going to have a narrow agenda next year. They're going to look at debt, energy, and deregulation, which means that all of these priorities may not be taken up, but we future-proofed it so that it can be implemented without having to rely on it being subjected to the normal practice of continuity.
Yeah. How do you track progress? Because one question that a lot of South Africans have been asking, at least on my show, is how does this benefit me, and how do we make sure that what is resolved at the summit, doesn't just fall part of the 2025 resolutions, but there's a tracking mechanisms and there's a continual commitment from the different governments.
It's the, plurilateral like the G20 and multilateral discussions have a people don't see there's no linear impact in the short term, right? If you look, you just take the critical minerals framework. What that leads to is a policy discussion in the AU. And it also means that those who want to stick to extractive economies now have a document and a baseline, even though it's voluntary, that guides the norms around how you extract minerals. It means that national governments must look at how we take this and implement policies to align with it. So in the G20, we do look at have countries developed the national capacities to implement what has been agreed to. And this is something that happens across the multilateral space. We need to hold ourselves accountable in South Africa, for example. If we agree to, whether it's in Brazil or here, that we're going to, for example, have a progressive taxation regime where, given what the inequality report talks about, that inequality is distorted more severely now than it has been previously, in that you've got the rise of billionaires who pay almost no tax, in some of the industries, and that you can actually tax them in a certain way to drive development. Or you can also then, in the critical mineral space, define the policies that lay the legitimacy for beneficiation at source, so that financial institutions are compelled to a certain extent to support it. There can be no unilateral action to disrupt supply chains, whether through force or other coercive measures, because there's now agreement that we all agree that beneficiation at source is preferable to extractive forms. This does, in the end, if implemented, change the way economies are structured, which have a definite and direct benefit to South Africans and other Africans. But it's holding ourselves accountable to take those words and translate them into policies.
The decision we've taken when the US wanted to send the chargé d'affaires to the closing ceremony for the handover of the presidency, are you worried at all as South Africa around how you've approached this? Because you're still trying to speak to the US, trade negotiations are still continuing. We're still begging them to reconsider, and there are some people who are concerned that the way that we have approached this and saying to their delegation, well, we're not going to have you come here because that's a breach of protocol, may get the US to retaliate. Is that a concern? So
let's just put this in context. So you plan the entire conference. You send out a note about when you have to have your accreditation in place. because, the accreditation, and we closed the accreditation at a certain time. The US had announced that no official will be allowed to participate. So they did not send any request for accreditation at the point where there was a closing. Okay. So there's also the technical thing is we didn't allow accreditations from those participating after the date. Because that's just the rules of it. And that includes senior people, right? Because it was well communicated well in advance. The US then makes an announcement which they then contradicted themselves. So there's an announcement from the State Department saying we want to accredit the junior officials to come and receive the handover. But they use the word participation.
Yeah.
Then there's a statement from the White House saying there's no such thing. Okay, there is no such thing as them wanting to participate. They don't want to participate in the G20. They just want to get there to be part of the ceremonial handover. So what we were saying is, firstly, accreditation is closed, and we cannot accede to the manner in which the request for accreditation was passed through. Right? It came in towards the end. We then said the request for dealing with this could then be done outside of, and also because getting into the room, you cannot get into the room purely to observe as a partner. So rather than disrupt the entire process, we would do the handover outside of the formal summit itself, and that's what we agreed to. It's not that we want to be vindictive, or we're saying that we don't want you in the room. It was just difficult to get them in the room under the circumstances that they wanted.
Okay.
Because when you sit behind that flag, you're a participant.
Yeah. Zane Dangor?
Yeah.
Thank you so much for making time for us. And once again, well done. I really appreciate your time. Zane Dangor
Thank you.
is the Director General at International Relations Department.
Thank you.